There's a moment most men never realize has already passed. A moment when she isn't angry anymore. She isn't arguing. She isn't trying to prove a point. Result, clarity, dignity, and emotional honesty. When certainty disappears, something very specific happens inside a woman's psychology. Before that point, when she feels secure that you're emotionally available, predictable, and invested no matter what, her behavior often becomes relaxed in ways that aren't always respectful, not intentionally cruel, not consciously dismissive, but comfortable. Comfort can slowly turn into assumption. Assumption turns into taking things for granted. And taking things for granted quietly erodes respect. When she believes you'll stay regardless of how she behaves, she feels safe enough to test emotional limits. She may challenge your decisions, question your boundaries, speak more sharply, or pull away without explanation. Not because she doesn't care, but because certainty removes urgency. When nothing feels at risk, behavior loses discipline. Respect doesn't disappear overnight. It fades through small moments where effort feels unnecessary. But when she senses that certainty is gone, her internal calculation changes. She realizes she no longer fully understands where she stands with you. She notices you're no longer reacting the same way. You don't rush to explain yourself. You don't argue for understanding. You don't chase clarity. That emotional shift sends a powerful message to her nervous system. Something important has changed. She becomes more attentive to her words, not overly careful, but noticeably more thoughtful. She listens instead of interrupting. She asks instead of assuming. She no longer speaks from the comfort of knowing she can say anything without consequence. When certainty disappears, awareness increases. And awareness is the foundation of respect. You might notice she no longer dismisses your perspective as easily. Before, she may have brushed off your concerns or minimized your feelings, assuming you'd adapt or let it go. Now, she pauses. She considers. She registers that your emotional world no longer automatically revolves around her. That realization shifts how she treats you. This respect doesn't come from fear of losing you. It comes from understanding that she already might have. Another subtle change is how she responds to your boundaries. When certainty existed, boundaries may have been negotiated, pushed, or ignored. Now, she doesn't challenge them as quickly. She senses that crossing a line might not lead to discussion, but distance. And distance feels permanent when emotional attachment is no longer guaranteed. Her tone softens. Not dramatically, not artificially, but naturally. This softness isn't affection returning, it's recognition forming. Recognition that you are no longer emotionally dependent on her reactions. Recognition that your presence is no longer something she controls. And control is the silent killer of respect. When one person feels they control the emotional balance, respect fades. When that control disappears, respect has room to grow again. You may also notice that she treats your time differently. She becomes more punctual, more considerate, less casual about cancellations or delays. Time is a form of value, and when certainty disappears, she becomes aware of the value she may have overlooked. What's important to understand is that this respect isn't something you demanded. You didn't enforce it through arguments or ultimatums. It emerged because your emotional position changed. You stopped investing. You stopped proving your worth. You stopped placing her emotional comfort above your own self-respect. Female psychology responds deeply to emotional presence, but it recalibrates instantly to emotional independence. When she feels you no longer need her validation to feel grounded, she sees you differently. Not as someone to manage emotionally, but as someone who stands on his own. This is why respect often shows up after distance, not during pursuit. During pursuit, value is offered freely. After certainty is gone, value is recognized. She may not say it directly. She may not even consciously understand it, but her behavior reveals it. When a woman knows she has truly lost you or is in the process of losing you, respect doesn't need to be asked for. It appears naturally because uncertainty forces clarity. And clarity reveals value that comfort once hid. When a woman feels emotionally secure in a man's presence, she often explores the edges of that security without even realizing she's doing it. Boundaries, in this context, aren't always physical or verbal lines. They're emotional expectations, patterns of availability, and reactions she's learned she can rely on. When she believes those boundaries are flexible, negotiable, or endlessly forgiving, she may begin to test them, not out of malice, but out of curiosity and comfort. Testing is a way of understanding how much space she has, how much influence she holds, and how stable the emotional ground really is. These tests can look subtle: delayed responses, withdrawing affection without explanation, small acts of disrespect masked as honesty, emotional inconsistency that forces you to adjust, accommodate, or chase clarity. When she believes you will always respond, always explain, always stay engaged, those tests continue because there is no real consequence. The boundary exists in words, but not in reality. But when she senses a genuine shift, when your emotional availability is no longer automatic, something changes inside her. The testing stops not because she suddenly becomes more considerate, but because the outcome is no longer predictable. Uncertainty changes behavior. She realizes that pushing too far may not lead to a reaction, but to silence. And silence feels far more permanent than conflict. You may notice that behaviors which once appeared regularly begin to fade. She no longer pulls away to see if you'll chase. She doesn't provoke emotional reactions just to feel reassured of her importance. She becomes more consistent, more direct, and less impulsive with her emotional moves. This isn't strategy, it's adaptation. Her nervous system no longer feels safe experimenting with your emotional limits. What's happening psychologically is simple but powerful. When access is guaranteed, boundaries feel abstract. When access becomes uncertain, boundaries feel real. She starts to respect your no without trying to reinterpret it. Before, a boundary might have triggered negotiation, guilt, or emotional pressure. Now, she accepts it with less resistance, not because she suddenly agrees, but because she senses that pushing could cost her the connection entirely. You'll also notice a change in how she reacts to your independence. When boundaries were tested, your time, energy, and attention were assumed. Now, she notices when you choose yourself, when you prioritize your life without explanation. Instead of reacting with frustration, she observes. She recalibrates. She understands that your world no longer orbits around her emotional needs. This shift often surprises men because it feels backwards. You'd expect less effort, less care, more distance. But what often appears is restraint. She becomes careful not to cross lines she once ignored. She senses that emotional safety is no longer something she controls. It's something she must respect. And this is where true boundaries finally work. Not because you enforce them aggressively, but because you embody them consistently. You didn't argue your limits. You lived them. You didn't threaten to walk away. You became someone who already had. Female psychology responds less to what is said and more to what is felt. When she feels that your boundaries are no longer open for negotiation, she stops testing them. There is no thrill in pushing against something that doesn't move. There is no reassurance in provoking someone who doesn't react. Over time, this creates a new dynamic, one where emotional games lose their power, where uncertainty encourages respect, where your calm presence communicates more than words ever could. When she knows she has lost you or is close to losing you, testing your boundaries no longer feels safe, and so she stops, not because you asked her to, but because your emotional position made it unnecessary. When a woman realizes that her emotional access to you is slipping or has already slipped, her communication changes in a way that is easy to misinterpret if you don't understand the psychology behind it. She doesn't suddenly pour out her heart. She doesn't confess regret or demand answers. Instead, her messages become lighter, shorter, and strangely nostalgic. This shift isn't random. It's a quiet emotional probe, a way of checking whether she still has a place in your inner world without risking rejection. These messages often seem harmless on the surface, a casual, "I just thought of you," a reference to a shared memory, a question that doesn't really need an answer. She isn't reaching out to restart the connection directly because she senses that the emotional balance has changed. Direct pursuit would expose vulnerability, and vulnerability feels risky when she no longer knows where she stands with you. Nostalgia is safe. It allows her to reach toward you without stepping fully into the present. By referencing the past, she avoids confronting the current reality where your emotional presence is no longer guaranteed. She's not asking for commitment or clarity. She's checking for resonance. She wants to know if the emotional thread still exists. This is why these messages often lack depth. They aren't meant to build something new. They're meant to test whether something old still lives. When a woman knows she has lost you, she doesn't want to feel irrelevant. Even if she has accepted the outcome, part of her still wants to matter. What's important to understand is that these messages are not manipulation. They are self-protection. Reaching out in a neutral or nostalgic way reduces the risk of rejection. If you respond warmly, she learns that the door isn't fully closed. If you respond briefly or not at all, she receives information without exposing her emotions. You may notice that she avoids emotional topics entirely. No discussions about the relationship, no confrontations, no explanations. This isn't emotional maturity suddenly appearing, it's caution. She understands that deeper conversations could force her to face a truth she isn't ready to fully accept, that she no longer has influence over your emotional state. These messages also serve another psychological purpose. They allow her to preserve her self-image. Admitting loss directly can feel like failure. Nostalgic contact lets her maintain dignity while still satisfying the need for connection. It's a way of saying, I was here. We shared something real without asking you to confirm or deny it. If you respond emotionally, she may continue these light check-ins. If you respond neutrally, they may slow. If you don't respond at all, they often stop completely. Not out of anger, but out of acceptance. Each response or lack of response teaches her something about her place in your life. This is where many men make a mistake. They overanalyze the message, searching for hidden meaning, or they respond with emotional depth that no longer matches the dynamic. Doing so can temporarily reopen emotional access, but it often restores the old imbalance. The power of these messages lies in their subtlety. They only work when uncertainty remains. From a psychological perspective, this behavior reflects a shift from control to curiosity. When she felt secure, communication was expressive and emotional. When she feels lost, communication becomes observational. She watches how you respond. She gauges your emotional temperature. She learns without asking. And the most telling sign is this: she doesn't demand your attention anymore. She offers a light touch and waits. Because when a woman knows she has truly lost you, she understands that anything more could push you further away. When a woman knows she still has emotional influence over you, she explains herself. She justifies her behavior. She defends her choices. She tells her side of the story in detail, not because she owes you clarity, but because she expects to be understood. Explanation, in this context, is a form of control. It keeps the emotional conversation alive. It invites engagement, debate, reassurance, and emotional investment from you. But when she realizes that influence is fading, the need to explain disappears. You'll notice her communication becomes simpler, shorter responses, fewer emotional details, less effort to clarify intentions or defend past actions. This shift isn't coldness or indifference. It's psychological acceptance beginning to form. She understands that explaining herself no longer guarantees understanding, and understanding no longer guarantees connection. Before this point, explanations served a purpose. They maintained relevance. They kept you emotionally involved. When she felt secure in your attachment, she could explain endlessly because your attention was assured. Now, that assurance is gone. She senses that explaining too much might not pull you closer, it might push you further away. So, she stops. Acceptance changes communication style. When a woman knows she's lost you, she no longer feels the need to convince you of her perspective. She doesn't argue to be right. She doesn't over-clarify her actions. She lets moments pass without commentary. This isn't emotional shutdown, it's emotional surrender to reality. You might notice that situations which once led to long conversations now end quickly. Where there were once paragraphs, there are sentences. Where there were explanations, there are acknowledgments. This reflects a shift from engagement to observation. She's no longer trying to manage the emotional narrative between you. This is also tied to dignity. Explaining yourself repeatedly to someone who is emotionally distant feels exposed. When she realizes you're no longer leaning into the conversation, she protects her sense of self by pulling back emotionally. Acceptance often looks like detachment before it looks like peace. Another subtle change appears in how she responds to misunderstandings. Before, she may have rushed to correct assumptions or clarify intent. Now she lets them stand, not because she agrees, but because correcting them no longer feels necessary. She understands that your interpretation of her actions doesn't control the outcome anymore. This can be confusing if you're expecting emotional reactions. You might interpret her simplicity as a lack of care, but psychologically, it often means the opposite. It means she has recognized the shift and adjusted her emotional investment accordingly. Acceptance reduces effort, not in a lazy way, but in a realistic one. When a woman knows she has lost you, she stops trying to reshape how you see her. She allows herself to be seen as she is, without defense. This is often when communication becomes calmer, less reactive, and more restrained. It's important to understand that this acceptance isn't always permanent. Sometimes it's a phase of processing loss. But during this phase, explanation feels pointless. Emotional clarity no longer feels like a bridge, it feels like exposure. This is why silence or brevity at this stage carries more meaning than words. She isn't trying to win you back. She's adjusting to a reality where your emotional availability is no longer something she can rely on. And in that adjustment, explanation loses its purpose. Attraction doesn't always disappear when a connection ends. In many cases, it changes form. When emotional pursuit stops and detachment begins, something unexpected often happens inside a woman's psychology. The energy shifts. What once felt predictable becomes uncertain. What once felt guaranteed becomes rare, and rarity has a powerful effect on attraction. When you were emotionally present, responsive, and invested, attraction may have felt unstable or inconsistent. Not because you lacked value, but because your value was always available. Emotional presence without independence can slowly flatten desire. It creates comfort, but comfort doesn't always sustain attraction. When everything is accessible, nothing feels urgent. Detachment changes that dynamic. Detachment is not coldness. It's not punishment. It's not emotional withdrawal driven by resentment. True detachment is calm, grounded, and self-contained. You're still respectful, still composed, still authentic, but you're no longer emotionally leaning forward, waiting for validation, or trying to be chosen. This is when attraction can quietly resurface. From a psychological perspective, attraction thrives on polarity. When you stop chasing emotional reassurance, you restore that polarity. You're no longer reacting to her moods or adjusting your behavior to maintain connection. You're simply living your life with emotional stability. That stability creates contrast, and contrast creates intrigue. A woman may begin to notice things she once overlooked. Your composure, your confidence, your emotional restraint. These qualities were always there, but they were hidden beneath over availability. Detachment removes the noise and reveals the signal. What's important to understand is that this attraction doesn't come from absence alone. It comes from how you carry that absence. If detachment is bitter, passive-aggressive, or performative, it repels. But when detachment is natural, when you're not trying to prove anything, it communicates self-respect. Self-respect is deeply attractive. You may notice subtle behavioral changes from her. Increased curiosity, more attention to your actions, questions about your life that weren't there before. This isn't coincidence. When you stop centering her emotionally, She becomes aware of the space you've created, and that space invites reflection. Reflection often leads to desire, not because she suddenly wants the relationship back, but because she feels the emotional shift. You're no longer emotionally predictable, and unpredictability, when grounded in confidence, reignites attraction. Another key factor is this: detachment removes pressure. When you were emotionally invested, interactions carried weight, expectations, tension, unspoken demands. Detachment dissolves that. Conversations feel lighter. Interactions feel cleaner. Without pressure, attraction can breathe again. This is why some women feel drawn back toward a man only after he's let go, not because they enjoy loss, but because the emotional environment has changed. There is no longer a need to resist or protect independence. The emotional balance feels equal again. However, this attraction is fragile. It exists only as long as detachment remains authentic. The moment you notice it and lean forward again, the old dynamic can return. Attraction, born from detachment, isn't meant to be chased. It's meant to be allowed. And here's the deeper truth: whether attraction returns or not becomes irrelevant when detachment is real. Because at that point, your sense of worth is no longer tied to her response. You're not waiting. You're not hoping. You're not strategizing. That emotional independence is what creates attraction, but it's also what frees you from needing it. Detachment doesn't guarantee reconnection, but it restores balance. And balance is the foundation from which attraction, if it returns, can return honestly. When entitlement exists in a relationship, it is rarely announced. It develops quietly, built on patterns of consistency and emotional availability that go unquestioned over time. When a woman feels entitled to your presence, your time, or your emotional labor, it's not because she's selfish or malicious. It's because certainty has created expectation. Expectation, when left unchecked, turns into ownership, and ownership is where respect begins to erode. Entitlement shows up in subtle ways. She assumes you'll be there when she needs emotional support, even if she hasn't offered the same in return. She expects explanations for your absence, but doesn't feel obligated to explain hers. She reacts strongly when you pull back, not because she's hurt, but because something she considered hers has become unavailable. But when she realizes she has truly lost you, entitlement collapses. Loss forces a psychological reset. The assumption of access disappears. She no longer sees your attention as guaranteed. And without guaranteed access, entitlement has no foundation. She begins to understand, consciously or not, that your presence was a choice, not an obligation. This is when respect begins to return. Respect is not about admiration or attraction. It's about recognition. Recognition that another person exists independently of your desires. When entitlement fades, she starts to treat your time and emotional energy as something that must be earned, not expected. You may notice a shift in how she approaches you. She asks instead of assumes. She waits instead of demands. She becomes more mindful of how her actions affect you. These changes are not performative, they're corrective. Her psychology has adjusted to a new reality where she no longer holds emotional authority over you. This shift can be uncomfortable for her. Entitlement creates emotional safety. Losing it creates vulnerability. She may feel exposed, uncertain, or reflective. But this discomfort is also where growth happens. Without entitlement, interaction becomes mutual instead of one-sided. Another important change is how she responds to your absence. When entitlement existed, your absence may have triggered frustration or resentment. Now, it triggers introspection. She doesn't ask why you're distant as aggressively. She considers the possibility that your distance is permanent. And permanence changes perspective. This is often when she begins to acknowledge your value, not in words, but in behavior. Respect shows up as patience, as restraint, as consideration. She doesn't push for access. She doesn't assume your availability. She allows space without trying to fill it. It's important to understand that this respect isn't about regret. It's about recalibration. She isn't suddenly realizing your worth because she lost you. She's recognizing that she misjudged the balance of power. And power, when misunderstood, distorts behavior. When entitlement disappears, equality has room to return. You are no longer seen as someone whose presence exists to meet her emotional needs. You are seen as someone who chooses when and how to engage. That choice is what commands respect, not demands for it, not explanations, not emotional appeals. And this respect changes how she carries herself around you. She becomes more measured, more self-aware, more intentional. She understands that she no longer controls the emotional narrative, and in losing that control, she regains clarity. The most important part of this shift is what it does for you. When entitlement fades, you no longer feel obligated to prove your worth. You no longer feel responsible for managing her emotions. You reclaim your emotional autonomy. When you understand how women respond the moment they know they've truly lost you, everything becomes clearer, not because the situation feels easier, but because the illusion is gone. You stop mistaking emotional reactions for love. You stop confusing attention with respect, and you stop measuring your worth by someone else's uncertainty. What changes her behavior is not your silence, your distance, or your words. It's your internal shift. The moment you stop seeking reassurance, stop negotiating for effort, and stop proving your value, the dynamic corrects itself. Respect replaces entitlement, caution replaces testing, observation replaces control, and sometimes, only sometimes, attraction returns where comfort once killed it. But the real victory isn't whether she comes back or stays gone. The real shift is that you no longer need either outcome to feel grounded. You've stepped out of emotional dependency and into self-alignment. You're no longer reacting, you're choosing. And that choice changes how everyone treats you. Loss reveals truth. It shows who valued access, who valued control, and who truly respected you as a person. When you walk away with dignity, you don't just leave a memory, you leave an imprint. Not because you tried to be unforgettable, but because you became unshakable.